Today is context clue day. You should have pages 10, 11, and 12 of your ELA packet in front of you. We're going to go through the anchor chart, the reading, and the questions just like we've done every day so far, and then you will complete the quick check on Canvas. Remember, these are just reviewing things that we've learned this year since it's the last couple weeks of school to make sure we have a strong foundation for the end of the year and moving on into the next school year. All right, on page 10 is your anchor chart for context clues. This gives us all the information we need to know about context clues. It says context clues are words and phrases in a text that help the reader determine the meaning of unknown words. Examples: mother wolves can be defensive of their babies, protecting them at all costs. So the underlying word is the word that we need to figure out what it means, defensive. So we need to look around that word for words that give us clues about what defensive means. So I see protecting them. And so I say that defensive means that you are protecting something because the context clues say protecting them at all costs. The second one, the reader can figure out that defensive means caring or protecting something. The phrase protecting them at all costs helps the reader understand this, exactly what we just said. Over the years, some traditions have evolved and are quite different from how they were originally. So the underlined word evolved, and we need to use some context clues to figure out what that word means. The reader can figure out that evolved means changed. The ed helps the reader know that evolved is a verb, and the details that traditions are different from how they were helps the reader understand that evolve means changed. So since things are different than how they were, evolved is a change of things. All right, let's jump over to our reading. We have a context clues reading here, and you'll see some bold words. Those are the words that we are going to try and figure out what they mean over here on our questions. So as I'm reading, pay attention to the words around those words because that'll give us a head start on questions 1, 2, 3, and 4. All right, at the top, like always, we have our little box that gives us some helpful hints and clues to remind us about context clues. All right, let's get started with our reading. Follow along with me in your packet, page 11. I woke up in the middle of the night to this crazy banging noise that sounded like drums. But it was like the sound of drums being played by someone who didn't really know how to play the drums. This was not the most agreeable of sounds. I lived with my parents in a small apartment in a big building, so it wasn't unusual to hear peculiar noises coming from somewhere else. Over the years, I had gotten pretty good at figuring out where these noises were coming from. I just had to concentrate. If it was coming from upstairs, you could actually feel the vibrations coming from that direction, as if the sound waves were almost washing down from above. However, that wasn't what it was like this time. It was coming from below. You could actually put your hands on the floor to see if that was the source of the noise. I slid my rug out of the way and pressed my hand to the wood. No, that wasn't it either. If it wasn't coming from above or below, that meant the noise must be coming from one of the adjacent apartments. I knew for a fact that no one was living in apartment 303 to our right. That meant it was coming from apartment 307 to our left, where a pair of young brothers had just moved in the day before. I guess one of them was learning to play the drums. Fantastic. All right, jump on over to our questions. Our first one is determine the meaning of agreeable used in the story. What clues help you determine the meaning? So when I read that question, I know there are two things that I need to do. I need to not only figure out what agreeable means, but I also need to figure out what words help me understand what that word means. All right, so give number one a shot. I'll give you a couple minutes to figure out what agreeable means and what clues you were going to use to help you determine the meaning. All right, let's go over number 1. Determine the meaning of agreeable as used in the story. What clues helped you determine the meaning? So when I'm using context clues to figure out the answer, the very first thing I need to do is find the word in my passage. So I'm going to come over here to my passage and I'm going to find agreeable. Now, the second thing I need to do to determine the meaning of the word or answer the question is I need to read the sentences around it and look for those context clues that help me determine the word's meaning, words that tell me what it might mean, or words that tell me what it might not mean. So I'm going to start and I'm going to read the beginning of this passage. I woke up in the middle of the night to this crazy banging noise that sounded a little like drums. But it was like the sound of drums being played by someone who didn't really know how to play the drums. This was not the most agreeable of sounds. Since they're talking about being woken up in the middle of the night, this crazy banging noise, drums being played by someone who didn't know how to play the drums, and then he says this is not the most agreeable of sounds, I'm going to guess that agreeable means enjoyable because those things do not sound very enjoyable. But it says this was not the most agreeable of sounds. So if I'm just looking at agreeable, I'm going to determine that agreeable means enjoyable. So the way to check your context clues is to put the word that you come up with, or the meaning of the word, in place of agreeable, or in place of the word you're trying to figure out, and see if it makes sense. This was not the most enjoyable of sounds. Does that make sense? He's talking about how banging drums in the middle of the night, being woken up by it, it doesn't sound very good. I would imagine that that would not be very enjoyable. So agreeable means enjoyable. Let's give number 2 a shot. Determine the meaning of peculiar as used in the story. What clues help you determine the meaning? All right, so the first thing I need to do is I need to find peculiar in my passage. So I'm going to jump over here and find where it says peculiar. Now I need to read some of the sentences around it and look for those words that tell me what it means. I lived with my parents in a small apartment in a big building, so it wasn't unusual to hear peculiar noises coming from somewhere else. All right, well, there's a huge word that tells me what it means. Unusual. It wasn't unusual to hear peculiar noises. So I think peculiar means unusual. Well, let's put unusual in place of peculiar and see if it makes sense. I lived with my parents in a small apartment in a big building, so it wasn't unusual to hear unusual noises coming from somewhere else. It sounds a little funny because I'm saying unusual twice back to back, but it does make sense. It wasn't unusual to hear unusual noises or weird noises or strange noises. All right? I'm going to give you a break in the video and I want you to try 3 and 4 on your own, and then we'll come back and go over them together. All right, hopefully that was enough time for you to answer 3 and 4. If it wasn't, you can just pause the video and give yourself some more time and then click play when you're ready to move on. But I'm going to go over 3 and 4. Number 3 says, determine the meaning of source as used in the story. What clues helped you determine the meaning? So again, same process we followed for the first two. Find the word in the passage, read the sentences and words around the passage to help you figure out its meaning. So let's jump over here to source, and I'm going to read some of the words around it. However, that wasn't what it was this time. It was coming from below, and you could actually put your hands on the floor to see if that was the source of the noise. So, source is where something is coming from. So they put their hands on the floor to see if that's where the noise was coming from. So I'm using the context clues. Put your hands on the floor to see if that was the source. All right, he's trying to figure out where this noise is coming from. So source means where something is coming from. And to check that, I just inserted my answer in place of source. So, however, that wasn't what it was like this time. It was coming from below, and you could actually put your hands on the floor to see if that was the cause or if that is where the noise was coming from. And if that makes sense, then you're good to go. So that totally makes sense. So we've determined what source means. Last one, number 4. Determine the meaning of adjacent as used in the story. What clues helped you to determine the meaning? So let's find adjacent in our passage and read some of the sentences or words around it. If it wasn't coming from above or below, that meant the noise must be coming from one of the adjacent apartments. Well, if we're talking about directions, we're talking about above and below. And it's not above and it's not below. It says that right here. It wasn't coming from above or below. That means it must be coming from beside or next to the apartments. So let's put that in place of adjacent and see if it makes sense. If it wasn't coming from above or below, that meant the noise must be coming from one of the next apartments or one of the apartments beside us. You might have to rearrange your words a little bit to make it work and make sense, because if I just said, if it wasn't coming from above or below, that meant the noise must be coming from one of the beside apartments. Doesn't really make a lot of sense, but it makes enough sense that we know that that's probably what that word means. So adjacent means next to or beside, because it's not above or below, so it must be next to it or beside it. All right, go ahead and log on to Canvas and take your context clues quick check. Come back tomorrow for our last video of this week, which is all about figurative language.